while everyone arrives into the webinar. And as you're arriving, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm James Banks. I'm Chief Executive of London Funders. And thank you all so much for joining us today for this briefing for funders on supporting communities affected by racism, Islamophobia and violence. From talking to many community groups over recent weeks, we know how important the messages of solidarity have been from funders. And on that theme of solidarity, it's really great that there's over 70 funders on today's call, and there's many more who've asked us for the recording of this session as well. And I think that just shows the level of concern that's felt and the commitment that the funder community have to taking action on some of these issues that affect our city and our communities. And I think while today's session has come about because of recent events, we know we're not really starting from nothing. We've seen big increases in hate crime in recent years across racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. And we know many of you have joined sessions we've hosted over the last year on combating far-right rhetoric and hate. And we've shared resources from some of those sessions as part of our solidarity statement last week. And we're going to send them out again after today's meeting as a reminder, because we hope they're helpful to you. And our thanks to Hope Not Hate and to Migrants Organised for working with us on those sessions and sharing their intelligence and their resources with us before now. So we know from those sessions and from many of the conversations with you and communities about how uncertain, afraid and attacked many people felt already. And that when we talk about the recent racist, Islamophobic and hate-filled attacks of recent weeks, we're not talking about something that's new. We're talking about a long-term issue and something that needs long-term solutions. So we know that that conversation needs to be about community safety, about mental health and well-being, about advice in human rights work, about combating hate online and in real life, about strengthening our democracy, about tackling racism and hate in all its forms. And we know that the actions from this conversation are going to take long-term, sustained and collaborative work if we're going to succeed. But we also know that hate is a system and that we've all got a part to play in achieving change. So whether you're joining us today because you're a funder of youth work, if you're involved in led by and for organisations, if you fund infrastructure bodies, health and wellbeing, advice and justice, social justice, whichever sector you're working in, it's when we really collaborate across what feel like sector or structural boundaries to us, but that we know don't make sense to people who experience this as real life. That's when we're really going to make a difference. So I'm really pleased that you're joining us today, and I'm really delighted that we're handing over to a fantastic panel of people who've very generously given of their time this morning to help us get that understanding of both what's happening and what funders can do in response. The panel is going to be facilitated by Rob Bell, who I know many of you will know and love just as well as we do. He's Interim Chief Executive at London Plus and co-chair of the London Communities Emergencies Partnership. And I'll hand over to him in a moment and he'll introduce the rest of the panel and get the conversation going. We're going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you've got a question or a reflection you want to share with the panel, please write it in there and we'll come to it later. And if you want to use the chat function, that's a good space if you want to share any resources, links or comments that you want to share with other people who are on the call with you today. And for those of you who are watching this as a recording, we'll produce some summary notes of all of the Q&A and the chat and any resources that are mentioned, and we'll send that out to funders after today as well. Once Rob and the panel have had their discussion, I'll come back onto the screen to wrap up some things in terms of suggested next steps. But for now, I'll disappear, get out of the way, and hand over to Rob to lead us through the discussion. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks very much, James. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. James reminded me that I was once a grant maker and have done a mix of regular grant making and also emergency funding. And I've worked more recently in the emergency response world. And as James said, London Plus has a joint endeavour with VCS Emergencies Partnership, London Communities Emergencies Partnership. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been speaking to a lot of people from the London Plus network, which we think is something like 400 plus organisations, people working in the VCS, on social prescribing, emergency response, resilience building, mental health, and so on. And we haven't gone out and comprehensively sort of studied this, but we have had a range of conversations from which we have derived information and insights and a kind of flavour of what's happening out there. And we want to share a bit of that with you, but we also wanted to create a session here where we bring, and through the speakers that are here, more in-depth insight from particular perspectives. So we're not trying here to be comprehensive and provide all the answers here. And I remember as a funder, there is a real temptation to jump into action because you have money and resources, and of course that's needed. But one of the things that's coming through most strongly, and James alluded to this, is that desire for shared understanding, alignment, concerted, long-term, focused effort and investment around some of these underlying issues. And I think some of the speakers may touch on that. So it is a hard balancing act. So we will talk between us a little bit about short-term, immediate, tactical things that are happening, and hopefully segue a little bit into those longer-term strategic insights and things like that, many of which you'll be very familiar. And I think we're looking at you as a group of people who are, deeply connected into organizations that work on this field, and between you have enormous insight and understanding of these issues. So we feel we're speaking to a very informed group, and just bringing different perspectives in to add to your own. So I may say a bit more from London Pub's point of view at the end in the Q&A, but I'm going to just quickly introduce the speakers, and then I think ask one to step in. We have three speakers. Minnie, you're here. I can see Minnie's here now. Minnie Rahman, who's Chief Executive of Praxis. Thank you, Minnie, and hopefully Minnie is in transit somewhere, I know, and joining us. Mudasa Ali, who is Head of Development at Muslim Charities Forum. Morning, Mudasa. And Harbi Jama, who is Director of Development and Comms at London Community Foundation. Now, each I'm going to ask to speak for a few minutes, and they could each, I think, speak for a lot longer, but a few minutes of top line thoughts and insights, and then we'll run through all three, and then we'll move over to Q&A as well. So, Minnie, are you with us?
Hi, yes, I am.
Hi,
Sorry
Minnie.
for joining late. I am in transit somewhere, so I'm going to just leave my video off because it's a bit difficult and I'm losing reception. So thanks for the introduction, Rob. My name's Minnie. I'm the Chief Exec of Praxis, which is a migration organisation which focuses on housing and homelessness. We have a huge advice service. We do service provision across London, and we have local authority contracts. It's also fair to say I've only been in post for 6 weeks, so I just took over from a long-standing chief executive. So the last few weeks has been trial by fire, let's put it that way. So some of the things that I think Praxis is focusing on in terms of the immediate short term, there is, increased security risk for both clients and staff, which you would imagine. We have a lot of kind of people with lived experience who are employed in the organisation, but we also have, loads of clients who've shared with us their concerns. Last week, we took the step to close the office while we were unsure about how safe it was to come in the building. Since then, I think some of the needs that have come through from the wider sector in the immediate challenges are things about how to ensure their buildings are safe, how to ensure that staff in general have a good understanding of safety procedures and what training needs are required. A lot of the sector is not very well funded, as you will all know, and a lot of the grassroots organisations and smaller organisations are struggling with the resilience element of what's happened in the last few weeks. So not only do they kind of feel unable to, protect their premises or their staff groups or their volunteer groups, a lot of them have a lot of well-being challenges going on at the moment. So those are two strategic areas that I think funders should be interested in generally, because they're actually going to in terms of ensuring that some of the organisations have more funding and support to do proactive security tests and take those kind of measures, but also to think a little bit more holistically about what well-being looks like actually for people who work in our organisations, because in the migration sector, it's a lot of people with lived experience. It's also people who are being threatened even if they don't have lived experience. So a lot of lawyers and immigration advisors feel very, very at risk. Some of the other things that we're asking for from the government and trying to proactively work on at the moment are communication strategies. What seems to have failed massively in the last week is just any kind of communication from the government towards migration organisation or immigration service providers. So while there was conversation, I believe, although I'm sure the speakers on this call will tell me in more detail, towards the Muslim community and how they might protect themselves, the immigration sector really had very little conversation with the government, and that's something that we're trying to practically push forward for, because in other senses the government has had an understanding through the EU settlement scheme and through the Windrush scheme that they don't have good relationships with grassroots organisations, service providers who are smaller community groups, and then they've recognised that by putting in place very good, or attempted to put in place quite good communication strategies to reach harder groups. They haven't done that in this instance. We're still waiting for it. So the sector is kind of coalescing around a need for improved communication with the Home Office around bigger picture threats. And I think in the long term, more generally, the kind of strategic question that I think the sector needs to focus on is, we have in the last few years been drawn towards this conversation about asylum seekers and through the kind of Nationality and Borders Act and that conversation. But what we are seeing here is a combination of hostile immigration policy more generally, and the way that that interacts with people on a daily basis, and those groups who are affected and cut out and at high risk, as well as the accommodation side of, locating exactly where asylum seekers are, where they're housed, how they're treated in those centres. So there is a need to kind of push the strategic conversation back towards immigration policy as a whole, and how the policy actually discriminates against people of colour and people who are not in the UK and choose to move here for whatever reason, whether that's asylum or work, family relationships. And I think the sector is kind of grappling with that at the moment. How do we move the conversation forward? Where should we take it? How do we connect this? How does Labour connect this back to the hostile environment? And how do we connect that to the far right violence and increase in hate crime? So that's one area of strategic work that I think needs resourcing, because a lot of attention has been drawn towards asylum in particular, but actually this is a holistic and bigger picture problem that we're seeing. And I think I would add that on top of that, the sector hasn't really engaged with strategically the conversation about media narrative and how that operates in the UK. And I think that there is quite a lot of work to be done connecting the migration sector with organisations that think about media standards and accountability and reporting, and works with those organisations to think about how the failures in implementing Leveson and the failures in the Online Safety Act now connect with each other, and how we can integrate campaigning around that. Because I think this isn't a problem, this isn't going to go away for us in the immediate future. Misinformation, disinformation, low standards in media reporting are going to continue. And Labour has said that they will be doing a review of the Online Safety Act. And I think one of the big asks from the sector is going to have to be to make sure that migrants are included as a single group, and people of colour and Muslims as single group, to review in terms of how effective the Online Safety Act has been. I hope that covers what we talked about before, Rob, and if there's anything I've missed, I'm happy to talk about that a bit more. But I think that's my overview of kind of where the sector is at the moment.
That's so helpful, and that elevates us into some bigger themes very early. And the thing that I will say, but you will want to, because you're accommodating this really elegantly, is that of course you're living through some of this as a leader. And you've talked about the impact on staff, but huge impact and reliance on leaders in this of our organizations. and also you're trying to secure a different space. There is a real challenge, isn't there, around how do you work with people who are made vulnerable and need security, but you maintain a kind of open perspective and allow people to come in and use and access support and resources. There's a real balancing act. So many thanks for getting us going. We heard you really well, the odd bit of breaking up, but hopefully you can stay on the line for as long as you can. Mudassar, can I turn to you now? Mudassar from Muslim Charities Forum, and just we have to pretend no one's listening to this conversation, Mudassar. So you run with what you have, but of course, feel free to freestyle and comment on what you're hearing from Minnie as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for inviting us to this space, Rob. And also thank you for sharing your thoughts as well, Minnie. It's incredibly insightful, but I think that there's a lot for us to echo there, and a lot for us to build on, in terms of looking at how we actually, what we can do to support one another, to drive forward some of our common concerns, especially around media narrative and disinformation. As a large volume of of what we're seeing with some of the beginnings of the riots has felt like it's come from disinformation from certain media sources, and the way that our consumption of media has changed and our sources of media have changed, but also the lack of, I would say, pace in keeping up with those changes on the part of policymakers, regulators, and others. So I think there's definitely lots of capacity there. In terms of what we've seen over the past few weeks in from different members of Muslim communities that we engage with, we've seen an incredible sense of mobilization from communities up and down the country, but also in particular in London. But there are some similar themes that we have noticed in a few different places. There may be a minority within those Muslim communities who are quite prepared, who are quite ready. But the harsh reality is that we can't rely on every organization to have former members of the police service or the local authority or whoever it might be on their boards to be able to think about this level of preparation and to understand the public sector and what's available in terms of support and preparedness and have those key stakeholder relationships. So we can see a bit of an imbalance there. And in particular, where we are seeing a bit of imbalance and a lack of pace of support provision, really, and a massive gap, is in the community anchor sector, but for Muslims, right? In that, yes, we recognize and understand that there is a fund that's been made available from central government, but there hasn't really been an attempt to significantly build relationships with Muslim community leaders in order to actually give them conviction in that fund. And there are also some structural challenges with accessing that fund that are faced on the part of the community organizations themselves. So what we're really understanding is that there isn't too much available for these holistic community hubs, which are providing a range of community and welfare support and services, in addition to some sort of religious services as well. So I might touch on that a little bit more when we consider our asks. And what we're also noticing is some concerns from members of communities as well. And these are repeated themes, so it's nothing new. But unfortunately, there's some significant evidence that we haven't made enough progress in these two areas in particular. One of those is women, is that we understand that many Muslim women are disproportionately targeted and have been even more so targeted over the past few weeks, in whether that's outright aggressions through attacks or whether it's microaggressions through incidents in public transport and other areas. So we understand that there's more to be done there. There are also concerns that we're hearing as a common theme amongst many leaders around how to engage young people in this. So how to actually engage young people productively in conversation and dialogue, and to support them so that they don't feel the need to actually engage in unproductive activity. So those are some concerns that that we have been noting. Now, where we see that potentially coming forward into some solutions moving forward is that definitely in the long term, there's some significant work to be done in community infrastructure building, right? And to invest in civic society capacity through a number of lenses. One of those is just in improving on our capacity to be prepared for, understand threats, and also respond to emergencies, as we haven't really had enough of an investment in that over the past few years. So as we've come into scenarios like this, there are many who haven't really been prepared. So there's much more to be done in terms of building up our infrastructure, and in particular for Muslim communities, and recognizing the intersectionality of different identities that many members of our communities have as well. The harsh reality is that we haven't necessarily seen substantial progress in building relationships between some members of Muslim communities and key public sector stakeholders who are involved in these spaces, such as the police and elements of the local authority. So we can't actually rely on all members of Muslim communities being comfortable with actually engaging with the system. So we need to invest more in communities to actually build that bridge proactively, and encourage better dialogue. In the long term as well, we do need to open up more conversations around how we engage young people, and also and what we can do to empower and better protect women in particular in our communities, to ensure that they've got the support that they need to better manage in these scenarios, and also feel confident and to come forward and advocate for themselves and advocate for their own sense of protection and comfortability in society. In the shorter term, where we definitely feel there is some room for scope and for improvement amongst ourselves as colleagues within the sector is really to rethink how we see community anchor organizations. So often people in the mosque sector do feel a bit excluded from conversations around community hubs and community anchor organizations. But if for us as an infrastructure community and a funder community, if we want to be more progressive and we want to be more outcomes led, what we do need to consider is that for Muslim communities, mosques and other buildings of a similar nature, which offer some religious services, are a gateway for lots of different community and wider welfare support services. And that's a reality of the nature and the culture of Muslim communities. So if we really want to try to empower those communities that we call hard to reach, and we want to ensure that their standard of living and that their feelings of safety and protection also improve, whether that's across Muslim communities or whether it's also across migrant communities and others, that many may be more involved with, such as asylum seekers and refugees, we do need to be comfortable in engaging with the institutions that serve them.
Yeah, so that's so thought-provoking. I can imagine that there was a lot that people will want to follow up on. What the thing that really jumps out here is around that idea of preparedness that you raise, and how critical it is to building resilient people, communities, organizations, but how challenging it is to secure the kind of mix of investment you need to really build preparedness. And it's a theme from the broader emergencies world, and a real challenge, cultural, practical challenge. But Harby, thank you. But Harby, before I turn to you, I know Minnie, you're on a site visit at the moment, and you've probably got about 3 more minutes with us if you can still hear me. Before you go, do you want to follow up on anything you've heard from Madassa before you have to shoot off?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Just to say that I'm in complete agreement in terms of the connection between kind of religious and faith organisations and migration organisations, and how we view that kind of community organising. I think one of the general feelings has been a sense of detachment between those two parts of the same sector, even where in some cases faith services are providing migration support and vice versa. So I think there is a need to think quite deeply about how we integrate our community work with the campaigning work and with a pushback on this kind of hostility. And I'd personally be really, really keen to think about how we can do that in more depth across London, but just more generally in terms of national campaigning.
Minnie, thank you so much. There's definitely more needed on this. We're just ducking in. So thanks for taking part. I know you need to leave earlier than you want to, but so you feel free to exit when you have to. But thanks for joining us. Harby, can I hand over?
Actually. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, thank you. Harby, can I hand over to you now, because you're bringing a very different perspective from a different type of organisation but with very strong, sustained relationships with people who are, on the ground doing the work, so to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear from Minnie and Madassa. And I think some of the stuff that I'll be touching up on is things that you've already heard, but hopefully will give you better insight. So at the London Community Foundation, we are deeply concerned about the recent far-right riots and its impact on Londoners, but also impact on communities across our 4 nations. And what have we done since this has come about? I guess initially it's speaking to our partners such as London Funders and London Plus, but also our network of community foundations across the UK. So we've had several meetings about what would our response be. And what we would like to do is we would like to have a fully informed response rather than just reacting quickly, because we know that this is a really complex issue and it needs to be tackled effectively. And we hope to do that with a lot of the funders who are on this call, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from us as well. And so one of the first things that we've done this week in particular is to send out a survey to over 5,000 organisations that we have supported through our newsletter. And the survey had several questions on there, and we're waiting to actually get the full set of data. We've put a deadline of the 19th, just because we know a lot of the community groups who would be inputting into the data are still responding to the crisis and what's come out of it. So some of them are doing active response already. So we're just trying to give people time, but we've had 100 organizations respond to the survey, and we're really grateful for everyone who's taken the time so far to fill that. So yesterday, we analyzed the data from the 100 organizations that have filled in the survey, and their income really goes from £3,000 annually to £2 million. So there's a big gap in regards to their income and responses, but also some don't have employees and some have up to 50 employees. So it's kind of giving quite a big range already from the sample of the 100. So 64% have reported that the main group of people that they support are Black and minoritized community, while 58% have indicated that they support refugees and migrant communities here in the capital. We're really proud to say that all London boroughs are captured in this small 100 respondents, and that also includes the City of London. And actually 29 organisations have actually just come from Lambeth in particular. So Lambeth have been they're quite strongly represented, but it's the views are from across all of London. So the key themes that we've seen is around fear and safety, particularly for Muslim places of worship. And again, what Madassa has said, in particular for women, so Muslim women have come across very strong on this survey. And then also people who are living in asylum accommodation and also hotels. Another theme that's appeared is obviously anxiety and the impact on mental health and well-being, and people actually being very afraid to leave their homes, hotels, and other forms of accommodation. And in particular, there's one that said that people actually even who are destitute or homeless are even scared of being outside. So it's really affected people across the board. 80% have identified that mental health is really their top concern. And actually what we are seeing is actually that although there were physical safety challenges and violence across other areas in London, mental health and that psychological trauma on Black, Asian and Muslim communities in particular is quite high. And 42% of respondents have said that there's an increase in discrimination and racism, and in particular Islamophobia. And I think it's really important for funders to use the word Islamophobia, because there have been organizations who have been quite shy about this. In our statement, we are very clear that this is racism, xenophobia and Islamophobia. So I think, again, the use of language is very important, and our community groups are very conscious of this as well. And unforeseen cost, I think this is really important. And once we share the full set of data, we will be delving into this a bit deeper, but community groups have already reported that they've got an increased cost in online licenses, additional venue costs, some of them having to move their venue costs, having to move their venues because that's where they usually are known for. So actually making sure that only the beneficiaries know where the next event or is going to be hosted, or the actual regular service, rather than other people externally who can disrupt that. And services that have been cancelled, but contractually the cost remains, and we're talking about professional services such as therapy, where the therapist has been booked, it's been cancelled, but the organisation still need to pay the therapist. But also venue costs, so venues that have been hired but had to be cancelled very last minute, which means the organisations have lost out on cost. Additional staff costs, so some part-time staff being asked to work extra hours because actually they're seeing that their beneficiary group is just demanding more, and the only way the organisations can respond to this is to actually increase the paid hours of their staff. And then security costs, both in regards to staff getting security on premises, but also putting in things like CCTV where organisations haven't had CCTV, or improving the quality of their CCTV. And then training costs, and this includes training on like physical intervention or physical safety training as well. So all of this is unforeseen costs that's affecting organisations. And again, it can affect organisations quite drastically. If you're an organisation that has income on, around £3,000, that's going to really significantly impact you compared to an organisation that has more than £2 million, but still is unforeseen. We also asked what funders can do, and the biggest response was actually just giving some core cost funding and focusing funding on security features and at community venues, mental health and wellbeing support, in particular culturally sensitive mental health and wellbeing support. And we already know in London that's a significant issue, that there's big waiting lists, and actually this is an opportunity to address that. Therapy for refugees and migrant communities, and then also the opportunity to connect. And that again, it's what Mudassar, Rob, you've even touched upon this, being able to connect groups and make sure that we're being collaborative in the space. Multicultural events, being able to set up future multicultural events that brings the communities together. I think there's an opportunity around that as well. And then investment in de-radicalization projects, and also investment in women-led organizations. So that's something that's come up. And then also crisis funding as well. And then finally, what can funders do to support further? So there has been things that have been touched up on policy in regards to migrant and refugee communities. Obviously, Minnie and Mudassar have touched up on that. Invest in projects that will support children to unite in schools. So, tackling at a young age some of this far-right rhetoric and making sure that our young people are being inclusive, and then investing into migrant, Black-led and Muslim organizations as well. So that's what we got. And that's a snapshot of the 100 organizations that have responded. So thank you to all of the organizations that have responded. As a community foundation, we will continue to respond to the evolving crises that happen. We've done that with COVID, and also alongside our amazing friends and funders in London and Grenfell, but also cost of living. I think there's a real opportunity for us to do something quite tangible and respond as a collective, and also focus on that multi-year support as well. And actually, even though this might be an emergency response, but looking at it from a multi-year funding, this has not gone away. The riots have quietened down. It's not at the forefront of the national media anymore, but I think it's our responsibility that we should take the responsibility to respond and respond effectively. And again, focusing on that core cost element, focusing on actually getting the money out and making sure that we take this very seriously. So that's where we're at.
Thanks, Harvey. And you've gone very quickly, and you're working with a lot of data and trying to make sense of it. And I'm certain that a lot of people on this call will be nodding, thinking, yep, familiar themes, familiar issues. I know, James, we're going to segue into Q&A, and I don't want to add more data here really, but just a lot of what we're hearing from other speakers here echoed across the wider community, the sector of community faith groups and charities. of course, about the language, the variability in the language and how to describe, hugely impactful. It's not a kind of tidying up it has a real resonance when a particular group describes this or ignores this or doesn't. Funders have huge power, don't they? And I've had a number of conversations with grantees of organizations, but because of my history in the sector, who feel like disappointed and hurt, and these are very robust people because their funder has not acknowledged a really significant dimension of what's been happening. It really fractures relationships, and it implies that there's not a depth of understanding. But the big things that I think are coming, that I can infer from the organizations I'm speaking to in different contexts, including being part of the response and Pan London response effort as a strategic coordinating group, is people want alignment and working together across sectors on this. They want to see people putting their heads together and articulating what's needed and sticking in it for the long term. Of course, they have short-term needs, lack of funding, all of the stuff that Harvey talked about, but they really want long-termism, alignment, and they want response, yes, but they also want leadership from people about staying with this and and really going at some of the root causes. I think that is the big thing that we're hearing. And if you ask people about what they want, they do think short term, they think emerging, of course. But if you get into a dialogue with them, they want continuity of funding to really address some of the issues. For example, that Mudas has talked about preparedness, the structural problems that stop some public benefit activity not being funded, and so on. So that's a big thing, James. If I can just add that in, and you're wanting me to go to Q&A now, James. Is that right?
Yes. Thank you, Rob.
Anne tries to multitask in public.
There's a few questions in the chat. Would you want me to just summarize a few of those, and then you and the panel can reflect?
Yes, that would be really helpful, and I'm kind of opening them now as well.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I think there's some concerns here or reflections agreeing with the panel about the rush to try and come up with solutions, and how we try to make sure that we avoid that temptation for lurching into what feel like more obvious things around community cohesion funds or safety funds, but how we build some of that longer term piece. I think there's something about how mechanisms for communities and organisations who maybe aren't engaged in that network, how are there mechanisms that make sure that where there aren't existing links between the funding community and community organisations who are working on the ground, what opportunities are there to build those relationships, to build that trust, and to try to make sure that we're working together on here. Some thoughts about how we differentiate between short, medium and long-term actions, knowing that there's a space for all of those, and we need to do them well. And some bits, I think, building a little bit on what Minnie was saying about the need to change policy. So what opportunities there are in the advocacy space, as well as the some more direct action space to be here. And then a sort of wrap up about how can we work collaboratively as a group of funders that I might come to in a wrap up at the end. But your reflections on some of those would be fantastic. Thank you. There's a lot
in that. There's a lot. And just looking at the questions now, and just looking at colleagues and reading the body language as best I can. Who is anybody jumping at the bit to try to take on one of these? Just unmute with us.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off with some thoughts or reflections about challenging policy. One of those is that especially in some of our own engagements and wider engagements with members of minoritized communities who haven't necessarily had the support to even establish mechanisms for self-advocacy, and who haven't necessarily had the opportunity to work with communities on or their own communities on educating them on why advocacy should be supported. What we're often noticing is that in some of the funding packages available around policy and advocacy work, there isn't necessarily enough there, or a consideration of community engagement, or even in capacity building for policy and advocacy work to begin with. As what we do need to recognize is that for many minoritized communities, members of minoritized communities, including Muslim communities as well, even discussions about engaging in advocacy work or systemic engagement of any nature, whether that's at the local level, whether let's say the local constabulary, the local authority, integrated care boards, whether it's at the national board with different government departments or directorates, there's a sense of cultural change which is actually required first, a sense of awareness building around the importance of policy and advocacy work to actually enable people who then want to do research and the actual advocacy work to have a critical base of evidence or data to move forward with. As some of the barriers that we notice at the moment are just in participation, right? So it's that if we don't already have a culture of participating in research or participating in evidence gathering exercises to support policy and advocacy work, are we actually going to be able to put forward convincing asks, right? Convincing specific asks to policymakers to change policy, right? Because we're starting with a weak foundation. So my recommendation for any funders who'd like to explore that a little bit more would be to consider how you represent community engagement or how you support community engagement within policy and advocacy work when you're funding minoritized or organizations led by minoritized communities. So whether that's in having actual funded posts for community engagement or whether it's having an allocation towards core cost funding to enable an organization to go about community engagement in the way that it seems or that it feels will achieve what it needs to support its advocacy and policy work.
Mudassar and Harvey, when I'm looking at one of the question there, which is a challenge, I think, which is sort of welcoming a discussion, but talking about the power dynamics and the filters that happen. So funders never really hear in the terms that people use some of the issues, frustrations, questions. There's no easy answer to that one. It's an enduring issue, but isn't the only way is to be in dialogue with the communities, the organizations, to be in dialogue without an agenda. It's very hard for a funder to do that, but to build that rhythm and that habit is surely the only way you're going to do that. And some funders are lucky enough because their culture is to operate they're long-termist and they've got the ability to do that. Others are more reactive. But is there anything more to that? I'd love to hear that person come back on this, but we won't. But is there anything more to build that relationship and sense of being really close to what's going on, and then able to feel more confident that they're really understanding?
Yeah, I think core cost has obviously come up as one of the main issues from the survey. I think as a funder, we're always trying to see how can we best support and listen. And I think longer term, and maybe even on the short term, for any emergency response, to take away that power dynamic is to actually go fully unrestricted funding and let the organizations decide how they will use that money and what they would use that money on. And I think that's ultimately kind of removing some of that power dynamic rather than assessing it on, particular cause or asking for budgets, etc., by going, actually, do you know what? We want to respond to this. We want to support you. Here's unrestricted funding. I think that is something we all need to move into in the longer term. It's a challenging thing to do, but I think we definitely need to do that, especially when it comes to emergency or response funds. And I think just creating more spaces for us to be able to just listen and hear groups, and also make sure that they're paid for it as well. There is, part of the power dynamic is that actually, as funders, we can be quite extractive in hearing from community groups, especially community groups of color, and actually not paying people to participate in learning sessions or insight sessions. And I think we definitely need to make sure that people are paid, because they're all coming usually from very small organizations. They don't have the capacity or the resource, and they're taking a day out, and that day could have been a day that goes to their service users or their beneficiary groups. So I think paying people for their knowledge and insight is a really important part of breaking that down.
Yep, I think just to add on to that as well, there's also some consideration around your culture as a funder, and what you do to move towards being move from a transactional funder who funds and then talks to someone or an organization when you need them to fill out a reporting requirement so that you can meet your programmatic reporting requirements as a fund, and move more towards being a relational funder, right? So what it is that you do to actually build a sense of safety, a sense of psychological safety with the leaders of the organizations that you're funding, right? So as you know, a practical example question to ask is that for amongst funding colleagues, at the beginning of a funding journey with an organization, do any of your funding managers actually just have an open-ended coffee or a conversation with someone about their journey so far, or their story of how they've entered the community sector and what drives them to do community work? Or do you get straight into business around what reporting requirements are and when things are due? So it's that, do you actually take the opportunity to build relationships and understand the stories and the ambitions, the motivations behind people serving on the front line of communities and driving change. So that could be something that's there as a practicality. Where we've seen some progress in London on this as well, and I think what's been quite effective has been City Bridge Foundation's approach to the Anchor program, in actually recognizing that with where you are and sort of the power dynamics, structurally, because of those power dynamics, you may not actually be in the best position to create that safety directly. So you may need to look for indirect means by, let's say, outsourcing to someone as a learning partner to do some of the listening for you and to do the evaluation and just build a culture of more unfiltered discussion amongst organizations that you're funding collectively, and then take the insights that you can from there. Right? So recognizing that it's possibly not your position to be doing that, and you may need support.
There's somebody made a point in here which is around the kind of the influence that people who may personally have a very in-depth understanding of the issues and a personal commitment and lived experience, they still have to get alignment with their boards in order to get the resources they need. That's very challenging. It's very challenging in foundations. And I know James wants to talk about collaboration, but my experience, which is limited and partial, has been building strong alliances between funders to have strong common narratives and understanding of problems is strengthening for sort of middle managers in foundations and leaders. You know, work with others, have a strongly held view of the problem, the challenge. I think that is one very powerful way of shifting the quality of board discussions and thinking, working in concert with others, and that sense that the organizations who are doing the work on the ground are really part of that, you know. So it's kind of co-creation, really. You all have to win your own battles back in your own organization, but see it as a joint endeavor. And I think that's what a lot of potential grantees want, because that's where you get that long-termism. Sorry, I'm just getting into hyperbole now, James. Is it time to shut us up and hand over to you?
It's absolutely never time for any of you to shut up, but sadly there is a sort of time limit on the webinar today. So I'm just going to try and wrap up in terms of a few thoughts to try and summarise the excellent work you've all shared with us. So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Madassa, Harby and Minnie. I think your insights are, as always, invaluable and also really important in terms of giving us ideas what some of those next steps are and what's important for communities and for groups that we can work with to try and tackle some of these issues. And I think, I mean, I've been scribbling furiously, and I know everyone else on the call will have been as well, because I think we've heard really clearly from you about what some of those needs are. So in terms of things like safety and security, both in the short term and as we think about preparedness. We've talked a bit about well-being and the impact on communities, whether you're directly affected by violence or whether you're feeling that experience of violence and uncertainty. We've also talked about some of the practical things in terms of immigration advice, about the importance of youth work. But also, I think underlying that, some of the importance of community infrastructure, and that support and that investment in leadership and in organisations and groups that are best placed to engage with communities on this. And I think we've also heard about the importance of recognising where people actually are, where people can be reached, where people come together, whether that's faith buildings, whether that's community buildings, whether that's other spaces, and how we integrate that community and campaigning work to achieve a change on a bigger scale. And I think that does link also to some of the challenges and opportunities that people have talked about in terms of the policy and engagement space as well, about whether that's the impact of the hostile environment, whether that's about challenging media narratives, whether that's thinking about online safety. There's a whole load of things that I think people can get their teeth into here. I think one of our reflections, and you referenced it, Rob, in terms of collaboration, is I think we've heard from groups, and I know you have as well, about the importance of funders acting for the long term and acting collaboratively. I think we're all working with community groups who are significantly under-resourced, significantly under pressure, and lacking the capacity to engage with a whole plethora of different initiatives and different ideas that come up. And I think we've got lots of learning, certainly from some of the responses we've done together in London, such as the London Community Response for COVID, but also some of the work we're doing on longer term change. So they're learning from the Propel initiative about how do you work together for systems change for the long term. And many of you are involved in those and want to be embedding that learning in your work as well. And those movements have been really important in terms of building solidarity, strengthening relationships and trust, some of the points that Madassa was talking about in terms of challenging our own cultures and our approaches as funders, whether that's on reporting, whether that's on learning, or just understanding the work that's going on and what the needs are in communities. So we also know, because a lot of you have been in touch with us over the last few weeks, that members of the network, funders across London and nationally, are already doing a lot in terms of building solidarity with communities, in terms of reaching out to grantees to offer extra support, engaging in listening and reflection moments like this. We also know, to be blunt though, from our work over many years, that some of the communities affected by racism, islamophobia, hate are not necessarily within our existing grant portfolios because of barriers that have existed to accessing funding. So I think it's also important we look about how we continue to build that engagement, that reach, that trust with communities. And I'm really grateful to Minnie, to Madassa and Harvey for sharing insights from grassroots groups, and Rob for the listening work I know that's going on through London Plus to really engage with communities and help surface some of those issues that may not get through some of our existing grantee networks. And I think that's also helping to show the value of infrastructure and the value of voice at times like this as well. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. Many of you on the call will know there's lots of stuff going on in the space. So at the moment, we're linking into what's happening through other networks. So from Migration Exchange, the Social Justice Funders Group, Funders for Race Equality Alliance, and the Civic Power Fund, who are doing some emergency granting as well. And we'll send some links out to everyone to make sure you're aware of some of the different bits of work that's ongoing as part of the follow-up to today's call. And as colleagues have said, we know that work on these issues, work on emergencies in communities, work on issues that affect communities, don't go away just because media attention moves on to something else. And we know that funders, I'm incredibly proud to be part of the funding network in London, because I know that funders are here for the long term. I know that people want to invest and stand alongside community groups for that long term. And we're going to be doing some work as a follow-up to this to look about how we do that work together for the long term to build that stronger and safer city for all our communities. So as a sort of call to action to those of you who are listening to this either live or in the recording later, if you've got any reflections from what's been said today, or you're ready to share with us in terms of what your plans are or what your thinking is, or some of the questions that are going on for you, please get in touch with us at the London Funders team. We're going to send out some immediate notes and some immediate resources for you just to try and make sure you've got access to these as quickly as possible. But we're going to bring you together again based on your reflections and based on your thoughts about how we can act together for the future. So it's really important, if you can, to drop us a line about what you're thinking so we can build that solidarity and we can build that collaboration and we can turn that into action. So huge thanks to you all for joining us today. Extra huge thanks to Rob, to Madassa, to Minnie and to Harvey for joining us and helping us think through some of those challenges and opportunities for action at what is a really difficult and distressing time for communities. It's really important to hear those voices and to hear those perspectives. I'm really grateful to you all for making the time today to do that for us. Thank you for the work you're doing in the background. Thank you to everyone on the call in terms of the engagement you're doing with communities as well. Please do get in touch with us about what you're working on and what you're thinking about so that we can do something together on this. But look out for an email that comes out later on today to follow up with some of the actions and some of the resources. Keep in touch with us. And thank you all again for your time this morning, for being part of this conversation, and for some of the action that I know is going to follow from here. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day.